The lighthouse had been dark for 11 years, and everyone in Gull's Crossing said it was better that way. Nobody bought it, nobody tried. The county had listed it 3 times, dropped the price twice, and eventually stopped answering calls about it. Local real estate agents wouldn't even show it anymore. Not after what happened to the Mercer family. Not after what was found in the water beneath the rocks in the winter of 2014. There were things people in small coastal towns learned to leave alone. Pelican Point Lighthouse was one of those things, which made it all the more strange when a man nobody recognized walked into the county assessor's office on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, set a cashier's check on the counter, and said he wanted to buy it. His name was Garrett Hollis, 53 years old, though he looked both older and younger than that, depending on the light. Older, in the lines around his eyes, younger in the way he moved, with a careful, controlled economy of motion that never quite left men who had spent years in places where a wrong step meant something permanent. He had served 22 years as a Navy SEAL, done 4 combat deployments across 2 different decades, and come home to a country that thanked him with a form letter and a handshake at a terminal in Virginia. His marriage had ended quietly, the way long absences tend to end things. His apartment lease had run out 8 months ago, and he hadn't signed another one. For the past 7 months, he had been living out of a 2009 Ford pickup truck with camper shell, moving between coastal towns in Maine, paying cash for fuel and food, and asking for very little from anyone. With him, always, was Kodak. Kodak was a 9-year-old German shepherd, retired from military service 2 years before Garrett himself had separated. The dog had worked bomb detection in 3 countries and had the disposition of someone who had seen enough of the world to take most of it in stride. He was large, amber-eyed, with a scar along his left shoulder, from an incident nobody talked about in detail. He slept lightly. He noticed everything. In the years since Garrett had adopted him through a veterans program, the 2 of them had developed the kind of shorthand that doesn't need words, a tilt of the head, a shift in posture, the way Kodak's ears moved when something was wrong, long before Garrett's own instincts caught up. The woman at the assessor's office had looked at the check, then at Garrett, then at Kodak sitting calmly at the man's left heel, and said, "You know about Pelican Point, right? What happened there?" "I know what's in the public record," Garrett said. "Then you know why nobody." "I know the price," he said. It wasn't rude. It was just final. She processed the paperwork. Garrett drove out to the property that afternoon. The access road was 1.5 miles of gravel that hadn't been graded in years, flanked on both sides by scrub pine and low blueberry heath that had gone rust-colored with the season. The lighthouse itself sat at the end of a narrow promontory, a white tower, maybe 60 feet tall, beside a 2-story keeper's cottage that had been built in 1887 and repaired only minimally in the century since. The outbuildings were in worse shape. The boathouse had lost most of its roof. A storage shed near the cliff's edge had simply collapsed at some point, and nobody had cleared the debris. He sat in the truck for a long moment without getting out. Kodak stood on the passenger seat, looking through the windshield, utterly still. "What do you think?" Garrett said. Kodak didn't look at him. His attention was fixed on something near the base of the lighthouse. A shadow, a patch of overgrown grass, something Garrett couldn't quite make out from this distance. He got out of the truck. The wind off the Atlantic hit immediately. Cold and salt-heavy, the kind of wind that gets into your collar and doesn't leave. He pulled on his jacket and walked the property slowly, the way he'd once walked unfamiliar terrain in places he couldn't name on a map. Kodak moved at his left side, close but not crowding, nose working the air in steady, methodical sweeps. The cottage was structurally sound. He'd paid for an inspection before signing, one of the few things he'd done carefully. The lighthouse itself was sealed, the lantern room dark, the original Fresnel lens still intact but covered in years of grime. The keeper's log had been removed by the Historical Society. The furniture inside was sparse and water-stained. Something had gotten into the kitchen wall at some point, and the smell of it lingered. But it was solid. The foundation was granite. The walls were thick. The view from the top of the tower, when he finally climbed it that evening with a flashlight, made him stop breathing for just a second. The open Atlantic in every direction, black water catching the last of the light, a fishing boat far out near the horizon, moving slowly north. He had not felt anything in a long time. Standing up there, with the wind loud around the tower glass and Kodak waiting at the bottom of the iron stairs, Garrett Hollis felt something he didn't have a name for anymore. Not happiness, not peace. Something smaller and more durable than either of those. Something that said, "Here, this is a place you could stay." He had not had a place he could stay in a very long time. The town of Gull's Crossing had a population of about 900. A single gas station with a diner attached. A hardware store that doubled as the local gossip clearinghouse, and a collective memory that went back to when the lighthouse was first built. People there knew things. They knew which boats had gone down in which storms. They knew whose grandfather had done what to whose grandmother in 1962. And they knew, with a certainty that didn't require explanation, that Pelican Point was not a place for living. Garrett discovered this gradually, through the sideways glances he got at the hardware store when he bought lumber and caulk, through the pauses in conversations that happened whenever he mentioned what he was doing out at the point. Nobody was unfriendly, exactly. Nobody told him to leave or warned him off directly, but there was something careful in how people talked around the subject. Like a family that has agreed not to mention the one thing as everyone is thinking about at Thanksgiving dinner. He asked about it directly. Eventually, because he had never been a man who did well with indirection, the person who finally gave him something straight was a woman named Addie Fontaine, 71 years old, who ran a small bait and tackle shop on the Eastern Pier and had the kind of face that suggested she'd stopped caring what people thought of her sometime around 1995. She was behind the counter when Garrett came in for a pair of work gloves, and she looked at Kodak with the particular approval of someone who had always liked dogs better than most people. "The Mercers lived out there," she said without being asked. "Family of 4. Bought it when the county first tried to sell it back in 2012. Father, mother, 2 kids. Thought they'd fix it up, run it as a bed and breakfast. What happened to them? Gone inside of 8 months." She said it simply. The father drowned, fell from the rocks near the boathouse in February. The wife took the kids and left the same week and never came back. Left everything. Just walked out and got in the car. She paused. Before that, there were others, different people over the years who tried to make something of that place. None of them stayed. Why? Addie looked at him for a moment. People say different things. Some say it's the isolation, the wind, the way the sound carries at night out on that point. Some of the older folks have other ideas. What do you think? She thought about it. I think there are places where bad things happened and the bad thing doesn't go away just because the people do. She glanced at Kodak again. I think that dog of yours might figure it out before you do. Garrett had thanked her and left, turning that over in his mind on the drive back out to the point. He wasn't superstitious. 22 years in the military had given him a practical relationship with danger. It came from specific, identifiable sources, and you dealt with it through specific, identifiable means. Ghosts were not in his operational vocabulary. But Addie's last words stayed with him. That dog of yours might figure it out before you do. He'd been at the property for 3 weeks before Kodak found the door. It was an ordinary Sunday morning. Garrett was working on the boathouse roof. A long, physical task he'd been chipping away at. Good for the kind of thinking that isn't quite thinking, the kind where your hands are busy and your mind goes somewhere quieter. Kodak had been ranging the property the way he did when Garrett was occupied with something stationary, making slow loops around the perimeter, checking things. Garrett heard him first, not barking. Kodak almost never barked, had been trained out of it for fieldwork years ago. But a particular kind of whine, low and sustained, that he'd only heard a few times before. Once when they'd found an IED under a culvert in a country Garrett didn't talk about anymore. Once when they'd come across a man alone in a field who turned out to be in the early stages of hypothermia. That sound meant, "Come here, something is wrong. I can't fix this one alone." Garrett came down off the roof. Kodak was at the base of the cliff behind the cottage, standing in front of a section of rock face that, at first glance, looked like solid granite. But as Garrett got closer he could see it, a seam, half buried, under decades of accumulated soil and a thick overgrowth of sea lavender and creeping juniper. Not natural, too straight, the outline of something rectangular cut into the rock, a door. Or what had been a door. The iron handle was so corroded it was almost flush with the surface. The frame had been deliberately obscured. Someone had packed the seams with mortar at some point. And then nature had added decades of its own concealment on top of that. But the seam was still there, still followed a rectangle about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, set into the base of the cliff at a point that would be below sea level at high tide. Kodak sat back on his haunches and looked at Garrett. "Good boy," Garrett said quietly. He got a pry bar from the truck. It took most of that afternoon. The mortar was old but hard, and the iron frame had fused itself to the surrounding rock through rust and time. He worked methodically, the way he did everything, chipping and prying in sections, not forcing anything, keeping his movements deliberate. Kodak stayed close, occasionally getting up to pace a few steps, and then returning, ears tracking sounds from inside the cliff that Garrett couldn't hear. When the door finally gave, it did so all at once, a deep, grinding concession, like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time finally letting go. Cold air moved out from the dark beyond it. It smelled of salt and wet stone and something else. Something organic and old that Garrett couldn't immediately identify. He got his flashlight. The passage beyond the door was low-ceilinged and narrow, cut into the rock and brick-lined, stretching back into the cliff at a slight downward angle. It was old work. The bricks were handmade, irregular, set in a pattern he didn't recognize. The passage went back about 40 feet before widening into a room. The room was the size of a large garage. The ceiling was higher here, supported by heavy timber beams that had grayed with age but held. Along the walls were wooden shelving units, most of them collapsed or rotted to the point of uselessness, but some still standing. On the floor, in the corner furthest from the passage entrance, was a metal chest, padlocked, about the size of a small trunk. Against one wall, intact somehow, was a wooden writing desk. On the desk was a logbook. Garrett stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, the flashlight moving across the walls. Kodak walked directly to the metal chest, sat down beside it, and looked at Garrett. The logbook was leather-bound, its cover softened by moisture but intact. The handwriting inside was small and precise, done in blue-black ink that had faded but remained legible. The first entry was dated September 1961. The last was dated January 2003. It took Garrett most of that evening, working by lantern light at the keeper's cottage table, with Kodak pressed against his leg, to understand what he was reading. The lighthouse had a keeper for most of its operating history, the last of whom was a man named Howard Pratt, who had retired from the position in 1988 when the light was automated. But what Garrett learned from the logbook was that Howard Pratt had not left the property after his retirement. He had stayed on as a kind of unofficial caretaker, and in that capacity he had used the passage, which he had discovered himself in the 1970s during a repair project, for a purpose that was not officially sanctioned by anyone. Howard Pratt had been hiding people, not criminals, not fugitives from the law in any conventional sense. What the logbook documented Entry by careful entry across 4 decades was a quiet and completely unauthorized operation to shelter people who had nowhere else to go. Fishermen who'd lost their boats and their livelihoods and were too proud to ask for help. A young woman in 1974 whose name Howard recorded only as L, and who had fled a situation at home that he described with careful, protective vagueness. A man in 1989 who had come back from Vietnam, unable to make himself live among people anymore, and who had stayed in the cave room for 3 months before Howard helped him find a place in a VA-run group home. A family in 1997, mother, 2 children, who arrived by boat from somewhere south of Massachusetts and left 2 weeks later with new names, documented in Howard's log with the barest of details and the notation, "Safe now." There were others, dozens of others spanning 40 years of quiet, unsanctioned mercy. Howard Pratt had died in 2003, alone in the keeper's cottage at the age of 79. The logbook's last entry was 3 weeks before his death. "The light is still on. I have kept it as long as I can. I hope whoever comes next will understand." Garrett read that sentence 3 times. He set the logbook down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Kodak's head was in his lap. Garrett didn't remember putting his hand on the dog's neck, but it was there. He thought about the morning he'd separated from the Navy. He'd stood in a parking lot in Virginia Beach with a duffel bag and a document, and he'd thought, now what? Not as a question, exactly. More as a fact of the universe, a flat, undeniable statement. He had spent more than 2 decades being essential to a mission, every morning having a purpose and a direction and a team. And then he had not. And then the apartment had gotten smaller, and the silence had gotten louder. And eventually the truck had seemed like the more honest option. At least in the truck, the movement was real. At least in the truck, there was no pretending to be settled when nothing was settled. He thought about the Mercer family, the father who had fallen from the rocks. He thought about Addie Fontaine saying bad things don't go away just because the people do. He thought about how different a thing is from a different angle. Howard Pratt hadn't haunted this place. He had inhabited it. There was a difference. What Garrett had bought without knowing it was not an abandoned lighthouse on a cursed promontory. He had bought the physical record of a man who had spent 40 years quietly doing what he could with what he had, for people who had nothing left. The metal chest, when he finally got it open with a bolt cutter the next morning, contained Howard Pratt's personal papers, a collection of letters from people he'd helped over the years, and, tucked into the bottom beneath everything else, $1,100 in small bills and a handwritten note that said, "For the next one who needs it more than I do." Garrett sat with all of it for 2 weeks. He wasn't a man who processed things quickly or emotionally. He processed them the way he did everything else. Through repetition, through physical work, through giving himself enough time to think without forcing it. He kept working on the lighthouse. He fixed the boathouse roof. He patched the cottage windows and replaced the rotten floorboards in the back bedroom. He drove into town for supplies, and he spoke to people there with a little more ease than he had before, and he noticed that they spoke to him with slightly more ease in return. He thought about what he was. He was a 53-year-old man with no address, no family nearby, no clear future, and a German shepherd who slept at the foot of his sleeping bag, and never once looked at him like he was less than he'd been. He was someone who had spent 2 decades making himself useful in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, and who had then, somewhat suddenly, run out of circumstances. He was someone who knew how to secure a perimeter, read an environment, function in conditions that would break most people, and who had absolutely no idea what to do with a Tuesday afternoon. Howard Pratt had been, in some ways, his own kind of soldier, not a SEAL, not a special operator, not someone trained to go toward the worst possible thing. Just a man who had shown up for his post and kept showing up, long after anyone expected him to, for reasons that had nothing to do with orders or recognition or reward. The light is still on. I have kept it as long as I can. I hope whoever comes next will understand." Garrett understood. He started making calls. It took 5 months to do it properly. He contacted the County Veterans Services Office, and then a nonprofit in Portland that worked with homeless veterans, and then a woman named Sylvia Crane, who ran a transitional housing program out of a converted motel in Bangor, and who had been, by her own account, waiting for something like this to land in her lap for about 6 years. He talked to a structural engineer and a licensed electrician and a contractor who, when he heard what the project was, offered to do the work at cost. He applied for 2 grants. He lost one of them and won the other. He talked to Addie Fontaine on the pier one morning and told her what he'd found in the cliff. He showed her pictures of the logbook. She sat with them for a long time without saying anything. And when she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "His daughter used to come in here," she said. "Years ago." She said she never understood her father. Said he was always helping strangers and she never knew why. She paused. "I think she would like to know about this. Do you have her contact information?" Addie did. He wrote the daughter a letter by hand because that seemed like the right way to do it. She called him 11 days later. Her name was Charlotte Pratt Nguyen. She was 64. She lived in Portland. She cried for most of the first call. She asked if she could come see the place. She came the following weekend, and she walked through the passage and into the cave room with her hands pressed over her mouth, and she stood beside the desk where the logbook had rested, and she said, "He never told me. He never told anyone. He just did it." "Some people are like that," Garrett said. She looked at him for a moment. "Are you like that?" He didn't answer, which she seemed to accept as its own kind of answer. The Pelican Point Veterans Refuge, that was what it was called in the end, simply, without elegance, opened the following spring. 4 rooms in the restored keeper's cottage, each with a bed and a window facing the Atlantic. A common space with a kitchen. A workshop in the boathouse, because Garrett had found that men who needed somewhere to put their hands did better with a workshop than without one. There were rules. You stayed for 30 days, maximum stay extended by approval. You contributed to the upkeep of the property. Not much, just enough to feel like you were part of something rather than being carried by it. You came and went at your own pace, because Garrett understood what it was to need pace. The dog was there, and that was a rule too, or close enough to one. Kodak had free run of the property and would find you wherever you were, and you were allowed to feel however you felt about that. Garrett still lived in the keeper's cottage himself, in the room at the top of the stairs that looked north, toward the horizon where the fishing boats moved at dawn. He had not planned to stay. He had not planned most of the things that had ended up mattering in his life, but he was here, and the place needed someone here, and that was enough of a reason. The lighthouse itself took another year to restore. The Fresnel lens was beyond saving, but the Coast Guard liaison he'd contacted, a woman named Beth Calvino who had become, over the course of the project, something resembling a friend, helped him navigate the bureaucratic channels to get a modern lamp installed. The night they turned it on, Garrett stood on the gallery railing, with the Atlantic wind in his face, and Kodak sitting beside him on the narrow walkway. The dog's shoulder pressed against his leg, and the light swept out across the dark water in long, even arcs. There were 4 men staying in the cottage that week. He'd told them the light would go on that night, and he could see 3 of them now, standing down by the water's edge, watching. The 4th was someone who didn't come outside much yet. He'd only arrived 10 days ago. He'd get there. Garrett looked out at the water. He thought about the morning he'd walked into that assessor's office, with a cashier's check for a place nobody wanted. He had not been making a plan. He'd barely been making a decision. He had been a man with a small amount of money saved, a truck he could sleep in, and a dog who was willing to go wherever he went. And he had looked at a listing for a property that everyone else had given up on and thought, without much more reasoning than that. I know something about not being wanted. Maybe I can make something of it. Kodak stood up from where he'd been sitting, stretched once with his front paws extended and his back end in the air, and then pressed his nose briefly against Garrett's hand before turning and heading for the interior stairs. Done with the spectacle, ready to sleep, Garrett watched him go. There were people, he knew, who would hear this story and focus on the lighthouse, or the secret cave, or Howard Pratt and his 40 years of quiet service. Those were the parts that made sense as a story. The mystery, the discovery, the history that had been hidden and then found. And those things mattered. He wouldn't argue that. But the part he thought about on the nights when he couldn't sleep, and he sat at the keeper's table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. The part that had actually changed him was smaller than any of that. It was the 3 weeks before he'd found anything. The 3 weeks when he was just a man with a derelict property and a lot of work ahead of him. And nothing to suggest it would amount to anything. Those weeks when the loneliness had been as big as the sky out here, and the doubt had been heavy, and the practical voice in his head had said, "You are a 53-year-old man living in a lighthouse you bought, because you had nowhere else to go. And this is not a plan, this is just postponing." Those were the weeks when Kodak had found him. Not the cave that came later. Garrett. The dog had found him. Every evening when the work was done, and the light failed early, and the wind picked up, and there was nothing between Garrett and the Atlantic but the dark, Kodak had appeared beside him. Not asking for anything, not performing comfort, just present. Sitting with him on the granite rocks above the water, sleeping against his back in the sleeping bag on nights cold enough to warrant it. Looking at him in the morning with those amber eyes that held the patient, uncomplicated certainty of an animal who has decided you are worth staying with. You could not argue with that. You could not look at a dog who had decided to stay and maintain the belief that you were the kind of person people left. Garrett didn't know exactly when that had shifted. There was no single moment. There was just, gradually, the sense that the voice saying postponing had gotten quieter, and the work had gotten louder, and the place had begun to feel less like a stopping point and more like a point. The light swept out across the water. The 3 men stood at the shore, watching it go. He should go down and join them. He would, in a few minutes. But for just a moment longer, he stood on the gallery in the cold, salt wind, with the Atlantic rolling dark beneath him and the beam turning steadily overhead. And he thought about a man named Howard Pratt, who had kept a light on for 40 years without anyone knowing, and the strange and sideways mercy of stumbling into someone else's unfinished work and finding that it fit exactly the shape of what you had left to give. The lighthouse sent its signal out across the water. In the old language of such things, it said, "Here. We are here. It is safe to come closer." For the first time in a long time, Garrett Hollis believed that too.